When Sarah Martinez stepped off the commercial flight at Kathmandu Airport that humid Tuesday morning in 2019, she looked like any other tourist. Camera hanging around her neck, hiking boots laced tight, and a backpack stuffed with dreams of mountain adventures. The immigration officer barely glanced at her American passport as he stamped it with a routine thud. But hidden in the occupation section of her travel documents was a single word that would soon change everything: pilot. What nobody knew, not the chattering tourists around her, not the taxi driver who overcharged her for the ride to Thamel, not even her worried mother back in Denver, was that Sarah possessed something rarer than any mountain guide's expertise. She had 15,000 flight hours under her belt, certifications for aircraft most people had never heard of, and nerves forged in the cockpits of medical helicopters over some of America's most dangerous terrain. She had come to Nepal to forget, to lose herself in the thin mountain air and find peace after the accident that had grounded her career and shattered her confidence. The plan was simple: trek to Everest Base Camp, take some photos, and maybe figure out what to do with the rest of her life. Instead, within 72 hours, she would find herself at the controls of a damaged aircraft, racing against time and weather, with 320 lives depending on skills she thought she'd never use again. This is the story of how a broken pilot became a hero, how a vacation became a rescue mission, and how sometimes the very thing you're running from is exactly what the world needs you to find. Sarah Martinez had always believed that mountains could heal wounds that hospitals couldn't touch. Standing in her small apartment in Denver 3 months earlier, surrounded by cardboard boxes and the scattered pieces of a life she was systematically dismantling, she had made the decision that would change everything. Nepal. The word had appeared on her laptop screen like a beacon while she mindlessly scrolled through travel websites at 2 a.m. Unable to sleep, unable to forget. The accident had happened on a Tuesday. Funny how the worst days of your life always seem to fall on Tuesdays. She had been piloting a medical helicopter, rushing a critically injured child from a remote mountain location to Children's Hospital. 15 years of flying experience, thousands of successful missions, and it all came down to one moment when the weather turned, visibility dropped to zero, and a sudden downdraft slammed her aircraft into the side of a ridge. The child survived. Sarah survived. But her confidence didn't. The investigation cleared her of any wrongdoing. Weather conditions beyond her control, they said. Heroic efforts under impossible circumstances, they said. The commendations and awards arrived in the mail while she sat in her apartment, staring at the pilot's license she could no longer bear to look at. Every time she closed her eyes, she could hear the rotors failing, feel the sickening drop, see the fear in her co-pilot's eyes. Amanda Rivera, the trauma counselor assigned to her case, had been patient but direct during their final session. Sarah, you're one of the best pilots I've ever worked with in 15 years of treating aviators. But you're letting one moment define your entire career. Sometimes the best thing you can do is step away, get some perspective, and remember who you were before this happened. That's how she found herself researching trekking routes in the Himalayas instead of looking for new flying jobs. Nepal called to something deep inside her, something that remembered why she had fallen in love with aviation in the first place. The freedom, the challenge, the way the world looked different from up high. Her mother had been less than enthusiastic about the plan. Sarah, honey, you're talking about hiking to the top of the world when you won't even drive over the mountain pass to visit your sister. Don't you think you should start smaller? But Sarah needed big. She needed something so completely different from her old life that it would force her to become someone new. Someone who wasn't defined by that Tuesday in September when everything went wrong. The journey to Nepal took 36 hours of flights, layovers, and fitful airplane sleep. Sarah spent most of the time reading about the region, learning phrases in Nepali, and trying not to think about the fact that she was voluntarily putting herself closer to the sky than she had been since the accident. The irony wasn't lost on her that someone afraid to fly was choosing to visit some of the highest places on Earth. Kathmandu hit her like a sensory explosion. The moment she stepped out of Tribhuvan International Airport, she was surrounded by a chaos of sounds, smells and sights that bore no resemblance to the ordered world she had left behind in Denver. Taxi drivers shouted competing offers in broken English, vendors pushed forward with marigold garlands, and the air itself seemed thick with dust, diesel fumes and the indefinable scent of a city where millions of people lived their entire lives in the space that would house thousands in America. Her driver, a weathered man named Karma, who spoke excellent English despite his modest appearance, navigated the crowded streets with the casual confidence of someone who had been doing this for decades. "First time in Nepal?" he asked, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "Yes," Sarah replied. watching the organized chaos outside her window. Motorcycles weaved between cars and buses like schools of fish, their riders displaying a casual relationship with physics that would have terrified her in any other context. It's quite overwhelming. Karma laughed, a warm sound that seemed to come from deep in his chest. Kathmandu is like learning to swim by jumping into the ocean. Better to dive in completely than to stand on the shore and worry about the waves. The metaphor hit closer to home than he could have known. Sarah had spent 3 months standing on the shore, afraid to get back in the water. Maybe it was time to dive. Her hotel in Thamel, the tourist district of Kathmandu, was a 3-story building wedged between a gear shop and a restaurant that advertised authentic international cuisine in 6 different languages. The lobby was decorated with thankas and prayer flags, and the air smelled like incense and the lingering aroma of dalbat from the kitchen below. The proprietor, a middle-aged woman named Pema, greeted her with genuine warmth and handed her a cup of tea without being asked.
You are here for trekking, yes?
Everest Base Camp? Sarah nodded, surprised by how good the tea tasted after the long journey. That's the plan. I need to arrange for permits and a guide. Very good season for base camp now, Penna said, settling into the chair across from Sarah with her own cup of tea. Weather is stable, not too many crowds. You have experience with altitude? The question was more loaded than Pema could have known. Sarah had flown at altitude countless times, had understood the effects of thin air on both aircraft and human performance, but she had never actually experienced it from ground level. Some, she said, which was technically true if you counted the view from a helicopter cockpit. That evening, Sarah walked the narrow streets of Thamel, past shops selling everything from genuine North Face gear to convincing knockoffs, past restaurants where trekkers compared stories over beer and dalbat. She found herself drawn to a small shop specializing in climbing equipment, where the owner, a Sherpa named Tenzing, was discussing route conditions with a group of mountaineers. The weather window is good for the next 2 weeks, Tenzing was saying, pointing to a detailed map of the Everest region. But monsoon season is unpredictable this year. Best to move quickly. Sarah lingered at the edge of the conversation, studying the map. The route to base camp wound through villages with names she had practiced pronouncing: Namshi Bazaar, Tengbosch, Dingbosch. Each represented a step higher into the thin air, further from the world she knew. You are planning to trek? Tenzing asked, noticing her interest. Everest Base Camp, Sarah confirmed. I'm looking for a guide. Tenzing studied her with the appraising look of someone who had spent years reading the capabilities and limitations of foreign trekkers. Good choice. Very important to have experienced guide for base camp. Altitude sickness is serious business. You have medical training? The question caught Sarah off guard. Some first aid, but I'm not a doctor. Smart to be prepared, Tenzing said. Many people think mountain is just long walk. Mountain has its own rules. As their grape wild the conscience, to continue while they reign. Then there was a fiery opening to the people who had taken over our bedroom to be his father's counsel. Aviation regulations, safety protocols, emergency procedures. Every flight had been a carefully orchestrated dance between preparation and adaptation, between following the checklist and making split-second decisions when the unexpected happened. The unexpected. That's what had broken her confidence. She had followed every rule, executed every procedure correctly, and still couldn't control the moment when weather and physics and bad luck converged to tear her aircraft out of the sky. Maybe that was why she had come to Nepal, not to conquer anything, but to learn how to make peace with the uncontrollable. To find a way to trust herself again in a place where the margin for error was measured in oxygen molecules and footsteps on rocky trail. The next morning brought her first real taste of what lay ahead. She hired a guide recommended by Pema, a soft-spoken man named Ang Dorje, who had summited Everest 3 times and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to read the moods of the world's highest mountains. Together they spent the day gathering permits, checking gear, and planning their route. Most important thing on mountain is listening, Ang Dorje told her as they sat in a tea house, reviewing their itinerary. Listen to your body, listen to weather, listen to mountain. Mountain always tells you what it needs, but many people forget to listen. Sarah found herself thinking about listening as they took a short acclimatization hike on the hills surrounding Kathmandu. The air was thinner than she was used to, even at this relatively low altitude, and she could feel her heart working harder to pump oxygen to her muscles. It was a different kind of awareness than she was used to, more immediate and physical than the technical monitoring she had done in aircraft. How did you become a guide? Sarah asked as they paused to rest on a ridge overlooking the valley. Ang Dorje smiled, his face creasing in lines earned from years of high-altitude sun. My father was porter, carried loads for expeditions. I grew up in mountains, learned that Western people pay good money to walk where we live every day, but also learned that mountains are dangerous for people who don't understand them. Good guide keeps people safe, helps them have good experience. What's the worst situation you've encountered? His expression grew serious. Many situations, whether that changes in minutes. People who get sick and refuse to turn around. Equipment failures. But worst is always when people stop listening. When they think they know better than mountain. As they descended back toward the city, Sarah found herself wondering what the mountain would tell her. Whether she was ready to listen. Whether she could find the trust in herself that had been shattered on that Tuesday when everything went wrong. That evening, as she packed her gear for the flight to Lukla that would begin her trek, Sarah discovered a letter that her mother had slipped into her backpack. The familiar handwriting brought tears to her eyes before she even opened it. My dearest Sarah, it read, I know you think you need to run away from who you are, but I've watched you your entire life, and I've never seen you run from anything. What you're doing isn't running away. It's running towards something. I just hope you find whatever it is you're looking for up there in those mountains. All my love, Mum. Sarah folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the side pocket of her backpack, right next to the pilot's license she had brought with her despite telling herself she was done with flying forever. Some things she was beginning to understand. You carried with you no matter how far you traveled to escape them. The question was whether you carried them as burdens or as tools. Tomorrow she would begin to find out. The flight from Kathmandu to Lukla was everything Sarah had both dreaded and anticipated. Tenzing Airport, also known as Hillary Airport, had earned its reputation as one of the world's most dangerous airstrips, carved into a mountainside at 9,334 feet above sea level. The runway was short, sloped, and ended in a cliff face that dropped away into a valley thousands of feet below. Sarah pressed her face to the small window of the Twin Otter aircraft, watching the green hills of Nepal rise toward them like massive waves frozen in time. She could see the pilot in the cockpit ahead, making constant adjustments as mountain thermals buffeted the small plane. Her trained eye automatically assessed his technique, noted the way he handled the turbulence, recognized the precise moment when he began his approach to the infamous runway. Nervous? Asked the German trekker, sitting beside her, noticing her white knuckles as she gripped the armrest. A little, Sarah admitted, though her nervousness had nothing to do with the landing and everything to do with how familiar the cockpit procedures looked, how natural it felt to anticipate the pilot's next move. The landing was textbook perfect, the pilot greasing the aircraft onto the upward-sloping runway with the kind of precision that made it look effortless. As the plane rolled to a stop, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Professional admiration for another pilot's skill. Lukla hit her senses like a mountain symphony. The air was thin and crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the faint diesel smell from the generators that powered the village. Prayer flags fluttered in the constant wind, their colors bright against the backdrop of snow-capped peaks that seemed to rise directly from the runway. Porters moved past them, carrying impossibly heavy loads, their rhythmic breathing visible in the cool air. Ang Dorje met them at the small terminal building, his familiar smile a welcome sight in the chaos of arriving trekkers and departing tourists. Good flight? He asked, shouldering his own pack with the easy motion of someone who had done this thousands of times. Beautiful, Sarah replied, surprising herself by meaning it. The flight that should have terrified her had instead reminded her why she had fallen in love with aviation in the first place. There was something pure about flying in these mountains, something that stripped away all the complications of modern aviation and reduced it to the fundamental relationship between pilot, aircraft, and environment. Their trek began immediately, following the well-worn path that would take them through the heart of the Khumbu Valley toward Everest Base Camp. The trail was a highway by Himalayan standards, wide enough for yaks, and busy with foot traffic moving in both directions. Sarah fell into the rhythm of walking, letting her body adjust to the altitude and her mind process the overwhelming beauty of the landscape around her. The first day took them through rhododendron forests and across suspension bridges that swayed gently over rushing rivers. Sarah found herself stopping frequently, not from exhaustion but from the need to absorb what she was seeing. Villages clung to hillsides in defiance of gravity, their whitewashed buildings and golden monasteries creating splashes of human presence against the vast wilderness. Take your time, Ang Dorje advised during one of their rest stops. Mountain is not going anywhere. Better to arrive healthy than arrive fast. It was advice Sarah had given to countless helicopter crews over the years, usually in the context of weather delays or mechanical issues. Safety first, mission second, schedule third. She had never expected to apply those priorities to her own feet on a mountain trail. They spent their first night in Phak Ding, a small village that existed primarily to serve trekkers on their way to and from base camp. The lodge was simple but warm, and Sarah found herself sharing dinner with a diverse group of adventurers from around the world. A British teacher on sabbatical, 2 Australian doctors celebrating the completion of their residencies, an American businessman who had decided to climb Everest as a midlife crisis antidote.
What brings you to Nepal? Asked Dr. Farrell.
Emily Chen, one of the Australians, as they shared a meal of dal bhat and vegetable curry. Sarah had been dreading this question, but she found herself answering honestly. I needed a break from my job. Figured the mountains might help me figure out what comes next. What kind of work do you do? Pressed the businessman, whose name was Richard and who seemed genuinely interested in everyone's story. I was a pilot, Sarah said, using the past tense deliberately. Medical helicopters mostly. The table fell quiet for a moment, and Sarah realized she had revealed more than she intended. There was something about the combination of thin air and genuine human connection that made secrets harder to maintain. That must have been incredible work, Emily said finally. Saving lives every day. Sometimes, Sarah replied. Other times you just do your best and hope it's enough. The conversation moved on to other topics, but Sarah noticed Ang Dorje watching her with a thoughtful expression. Later, as the group dispersed to their rooms, he pulled her aside. Medical helicopter pilot is a very skilled job, he said quietly. Difficult flying, much responsibility. Sarah nodded, unsure where the conversation was heading. Sometimes mountain presents situations where special skills are needed, Ang Dorje continued. Good to know who has what abilities. There was something in his tone that suggested this wasn't idle conversation, but Sarah was too tired from the day's trek to pursue it further. She fell asleep to the sound of the river rushing past the lodge, carrying snowmelt from glaciers she would see in the days ahead. The second day brought them to Namche Bazaar, the unofficial capital of the Sherpa people, and the first real test of their acclimatization. The trail climbed steeply through pine forests, crossing and recrossing the Dud Koshi River, on suspension bridges that offered spectacular views of the valleys below. Halfway to Namche, they encountered their first real traffic jam of yaks, the hybrid cattle that served as the primary pack animals for the region. The massive, shaggy beasts moved at their own pace, loaded with everything from trekking supplies to building materials for the lodges ahead. Sarah found herself pressed against the uphill side of the trail as a train of 12 yaks passed by, their bells creating a peaceful melody that mixed with the sound of their heavy breathing. First rule of Himalayan travel, Ang Dorje explained with a grin. Yaks have right-of-way. The approach to Namche Bazaar was marked by their first clear view of Everest, a distant pyramid of snow and ice that seemed to float above the intervening ridges. Sarah stopped breathing for a moment, not from altitude, but from awe. She had seen mountains from the air countless times, but there was something different about approaching them on foot, earning each glimpse through physical effort and determination. Namche itself was a revelation. Built into the side of a hillside amphitheater, the village consisted of stone houses and lodges arranged in terraces, connected by narrow paths that wound between buildings like the roots of an enormous tree. The Saturday market was in full swing, with Sherpa women selling vegetables grown in impossible conditions and trekkers bartering for everything from yak cheese to down jackets. Their lodge in Namche was more sophisticated than the one in Phak Ding, with electricity, hot showers, and even internet access. Sarah found herself in a common room filled with trekkers from around the world, all sharing stories and comparing notes about the trail ahead. It was there that she first heard about the problems developing further up the mountain. Weather's been weird this season, reported a British climber who was descending from an attempt on Island Peak. Lots of sudden storms, visibility dropping to nothing without warning. Had to turn around yesterday when clouds rolled in faster than anyone expected. Same here, added a French mountaineer. Lost visibility for 6 hours on the approach to La Bouche. GPS was the only thing that saved us. Sarah listened to these conversations with growing interest, her pilot's mind automatically processing the weather information and comparing it to the patterns she had studied during her flight training. Mountain weather was notoriously unpredictable, but the descriptions she was hearing suggested something more systematic than random variation. What's the normal weather pattern this time of year? She asked Ang Dorje later that evening. He shrugged, but his expression was troubled. Normal is changing. Climate change affects mountains first and worst. Traditional knowledge not always reliable anymore. That night, Sarah lay awake listening to the wind howl around the buildings of Namche Bazaar, thinking about weather patterns and the responsibility that came with specialized knowledge. During her helicopter career, she had been the person other people looked to for answers when conditions got dangerous. The one who made the go/no-go decisions that kept crews and patients safe. She was supposed to be on vacation from that responsibility. The next morning brought news that changed everything. A group of trekkers descending from base camp arrived in Namche with stories of a major weather system moving in faster than predicted. Several groups were trapped higher up the mountain, waiting for conditions to improve enough to continue their descent. How many people are we talking about? Sarah found herself asking, her professional instincts overriding her vacation mindset. Maybe 60-70 trekkers and climbing teams, reported the group leader, a sunburned Australian guide named Mike, plus all the Sherpa staff supporting them. Weather window closed faster than anyone expected, and now they're stuck in place until it clears. Sarah's mind immediately began processing the logistics. Food supplies, shelter capacity, medical needs, evacuation options. It was the kind of systematic analysis she had done thousands of times in helicopter operations, but applied to a mountain environment instead of urban emergency medicine. Are there helicopters available for evacuation? She asked. Mike shook his head grimly. That's the problem. Weather's too rough for helicopters and visibility is near zero above 14,000 feet. Even if it clears, there aren't enough birds available to move that many people quickly. What about the larger aircraft? The ones that service base camp? There's one pilot crazy enough to fly in marginal conditions, Mike said. Guy named Pemba, who's been flying these mountains for 20 years. But his helicopter's been having mechanical problems and he's grounded until parts arrive from Kathmandu. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a familiar tightening that she recognized as the first stirring of professional responsibility. There were people in danger, and she was sitting safely in a warm lodge discussing the situation like it was an interesting news story. What kind of mechanical problems? She heard herself asking. Mike gave her a sharp look. Why? You know helicopters? The moment hung in the air like a question mark, and Sarah realized she was standing at a crossroads. She could admit to her aviation background and potentially become involved in a rescue operation that would force her to confront everything she had come to Nepal to escape. Or she could stay quiet, remain just another tourist, and continue her trek toward whatever peace she hoped to find at base camp. I used to work around them, she said finally, which was true enough without being a complete answer. But Ang Dorje was watching her with knowing eyes, and Sarah realized that her secret wasn't as safe as she had thought. The mountain, it seemed, had ways of revealing who people really were, whether they were ready or not. That afternoon, as they prepared for the next leg of their journey toward Tongboche Monastery, a helicopter appeared in the valley below, flying at the very edge of safe operating conditions. Sarah watched it navigate the turbulent air with professional appreciation, noting the way the pilot compensated for updrafts and downdrafts, the careful route selection that kept the aircraft away from the most dangerous terrain. The helicopter landed in Namche's designated landing zone, and Sarah was surprised to see the pilot climb out and head directly toward their lodge. He was a compact man in his 40s, with the weathered features of someone who had spent his life at altitude. When he introduced himself as Pemba Sherpa, Sarah realized this was the pilot Mike had mentioned. I heard there might be someone here who knows helicopters, Pemba said, his English accented but clear. My aircraft has problem with hydraulic system. Parts not arriving from Kathmandu for 3 days, maybe 4. Many people trapped high on mountain. All eyes turned to Sarah, and she realized that Ang Dorje must have said something. The weight of expectation was familiar, but so was the fear that had grounded her career. I might be able to take a look, Sarah said carefully, but I'm not a mechanic. Pemba's face lit up with hope. You understand helicopter systems? Sarah nodded slowly, feeling the mountain closing around her like a trap she had set for herself. I understand them. What she didn't say was that understanding them and trusting them again were two completely different things. But as she followed Pemba toward his aircraft, Sarah found herself remembering her mother's words. Sometimes what looked like running away was actually running toward something. The question was whether she was ready to find out what that something might be. Pemba's helicopter sat in the landing zone like a wounded bird, its blue and white paint faded by years of mountain flying. Sarah approached it with the mixture of reverence and familiarity that came from thousands of hours spent in similar cockpits. It was an AS-350, the workhorse of high-altitude operations, and she could see immediately that Pemba took excellent care of his aircraft despite its age. Problem started 3 days ago, Pemba explained as they walked around the helicopter together. Hydraulic pressure dropping during flight, controls becoming heavy. Yesterday, almost lost control on approach to Tengboshi. Too dangerous to continue operations. Sarah knelt beside the aircraft, running her hands along the hydraulic lines with the automatic precision of someone who had performed similar inspections countless times. The familiarity of the process was both comforting and terrifying. These were skills she had hoped never to use again, knowledge that connected her directly to the worst day of her life. "Have you checked the reservoir level?" she asked, slipping into the technical mindset that had once been second nature. "First thing I checked. Level is good, but pressure still drops under load." Sarah nodded, moving to the engine compartment. The AS-350's hydraulic system was relatively simple compared to more complex aircraft, but that also meant there were fewer backup options when something went wrong. She traced the lines carefully, looking for signs of wear, damage, or contamination. "There," she said, pointing to a section of hydraulic line near the main rotor assembly. "See how the line is flexing differently here? There's probably a small leak that's only apparent under pressure." Pemba crouched beside her, following her pointing finger with intense concentration. "Yes, I see it, but how do you repair without replacement parts?" Sarah found herself thinking like a helicopter pilot again, problem-solving in the field with whatever resources were available. It was a mental process she had assumed was permanently broken. But here, in the thin air of the Himalayas, surrounded by the immediate urgency of people in danger, the old habits were reasserting themselves.
Do you have hydraulic fluid and basic tools?
"Of course."
We can try a temporary field repair.
Wrap the line with high-pressure tape, add clamps at the stress points. It won't be permanent, but it might hold long enough for emergency operations. As they worked together on the helicopter, Sarah found herself slipping back into the rhythm of aircraft maintenance. Her hands moved with automatic precision, her mind processing technical problems with the clarity that came from years of experience. But underneath the familiar competence was a current of fear that she couldn't shake. "You are very skilled with helicopters," Pemba observed as they tested the hydraulic pressure, "more than someone who just works around them." Sarah didn't answer directly, but she could feel Ang Dorje watching from where he stood with the growing crowd of trekkers who had come to observe the repairs. Word traveled fast in the mountains, and by now everyone in Namche knew that the American tourist was working on the helicopter that might be their only hope for evacuating the stranded climbers. The temporary repair held under initial testing, but Sarah could see the uncertainty in Pemba's eyes. Flying with compromised hydraulics was a calculated risk, especially in the demanding conditions of high-altitude mountain operations. "How many people need evacuation?" Sarah asked as they secured the engine compartment. "Initial reports say maybe 80-90 people spread across 3 camps. Base Camp Labuche and Island Peak Base. Weather window might open tomorrow morning for few hours, but if hydraulics failed during rescue operations..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Sarah understood the mathematics of helicopter operations better than most people understood their own names. Payload calculations, power margins, emergency procedures. In normal conditions, the AS-350 could carry 5 passengers plus pilot. But at high altitude, with thin air reducing both lift capability and engine performance, that number dropped significantly.
What's your normal payload at base camp altitude? Sarah asked.
3 passengers maximum, sometimes only. 2 depending on fuel load and weather conditions. Sarah did the mental arithmetic. Even with perfect conditions and flawless operations, it would take at least 30 flights to evacuate 80 people. With questionable hydraulics and a weather window measured in hours rather than days, the margins for error were essentially non-existent. That evening, the lodge in Namche buzzed with tension as more information arrived from the stranded groups. A Spanish climbing team had someone showing symptoms of severe altitude sickness. An American trekking group was running low on food after being trapped for 3 additional days. Most concerning, a Japanese expedition had reported a serious injury that required immediate medical evacuation. Sarah sat in the corner of the common room, listening to the discussions and feeling the weight of expertise she had never wanted to claim again. Dr. Emily Chen, the Australian physician from their trekking group, approached her with the directness of someone accustomed to making critical decisions. "Mike tells me you might actually be a pilot," Emily said quietly, settling into the chair across from Sarah. "I used to be, or still are, but taking a break." Sarah's license was still valid, her certifications current, her medical clearances up to date. She had left aviation psychologically, not technically. "I'm not sure there's a difference anymore," Sarah said finally. Emily leaned forward, her voice taking on the urgency of a medical professional dealing with a crisis. "Look, I don't know your story, and I'm not going to pretend to understand what brought you here, but I've spent the last 2 hours talking to Pemba about the evacuation logistics, and the numbers don't work. 1 pilot, 1 helicopter, 80 people, maybe a 4-hour weather window. It's impossible." "What are you suggesting?" "Pemba mentioned that AS-350s can be flown by 2 pilots in emergency situations. Pilot and co-pilot, sharing the workload, increasing the number of flights possible in a limited time window." Sarah felt her stomach drop. She had known this conversation was coming from the moment she admitted to understanding helicopters, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that terrified her. "Emily, you don't understand. I'm not just taking a break from flying. I can't fly anymore. There was an accident, and She stopped, realizing she was about to explain her deepest fears to someone she had known for 3 days. "Tell me," Emily said simply. So Sarah did. Sitting in a tea house at 11,000 feet above sea level, surrounded by the quiet conversations of trekkers and the distant sound of wind in the prayer flags, she told the story she had been carrying alone for 3 months. The emergency call, the deteriorating weather, the moment when all her training and experience hadn't been enough to prevent the crash. Emily listened without judgment, her medical training evident in the way she processed trauma without flinching. When Sarah finished, they sat in silence for several minutes. "How many people have you saved?" Emily asked finally. "What?" "In 15 years of flying medical helicopters, how many lives have you saved?" Sarah had never actually calculated the number. Hundreds, certainly. Maybe thousands when you counted the indirect saves, the calls where her rapid transport had made the difference between life and death. "I don't know. A lot. And you're going to let one accident, one moment where the physics of weather and altitude worked against you, erase all of that? It's not that simple, isn't it?" Emily's voice was gentle but insistent. "Sarah, I've been a trauma surgeon for 8 years. I've lost patients despite doing everything right. I've made mistakes that cost lives. Every surgeon has. But I keep operating because the alternative is letting people die who didn't have to." Before Sarah could respond, Angdor appeared at their table, his face grave. "Radio message from base camp. Weather getting worse. Japanese climber with injured leg, infection spreading. Maybe 12 hours before medical evacuation absolutely necessary." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a pack she had tried to leave behind. In the background, she could hear other conversations stopping as word spread through the lodge. The mathematics of the situation were becoming clearer to everyone. 1 pilot, 1 questionable helicopter, a closing weather window, and people who would die without help. "There's something else," Angdor continued, lowering his voice. "Pemba, very skilled pilot, but he trained on flat land, then learnt mountains through experience. No formal high-altitude training, no instrument flying certification. Tomorrow's weather will require both." Sarah understood what he was not saying directly. Pemba was a competent pilot in good conditions, but the rescue operation would require capabilities that went beyond basic mountain flying. Someone would need to navigate by instruments in zero visibility, calculate power and performance margins for multiple high-altitude landings, and maintain aircraft control in conditions that would challenge even experienced pilots. Someone like her. "How long since you've flown?" Emily asked quietly. 3 months, 2 weeks, 4 days. Sarah replied without hesitation, the precision revealing just how carefully she had been counting. "And before the accident, how often did you fly in conditions like this?" "Every day. Mountain rescue was our specialty. Weather that grounded everyone else was when we were busiest." As if summoned by their conversation, Pemba appeared at their table, his expression mixing hope and desperation in equal measure. "Excuse me, but Angdor says you might be qualified pilot?" Sarah looked around the table at the faces watching her expectantly. Emily with her surgeon's understanding of life and death decisions. Angdor with his mountain wisdom and quiet confidence. Pemba with the weight of 80 lives pressing on his shoulders. "I was," she said carefully. "Weather report says possible clear window tomorrow morning, maybe 3 hours, but conditions will be marginal, instrument flying required. I'm good pilot, but not trained for these conditions." The request hung in the air between them like a bridge Sarah could choose to cross or leave unbuilt. She thought about her mother's letter, about Dr. Dolly, Rivera's advice to remember who she was before the accident happened. She thought about the Japanese climber fighting infection at 17,000 feet. About families waiting for news from loved ones trapped in the mountains. If I said yes, Sarah said slowly, it would have to be with full pilot-in-command authority. No arguments about flight decisions, no pressure to take risks beyond acceptable margins. People die when pilots let external pressure override safety protocols. Pemba nodded immediately. Of course, you would be mission commander. And we'd need to brief emergency procedures thoroughly. If hydraulics fail during rescue operations, we'd need split-second coordination to maintain aircraft control. You know AS-350 emergency procedures? I could fly an AS-350 in my sleep. The words came out with such confidence that Sarah surprised herself. Despite 3 months of self-doubt, the technical knowledge was still there, as accessible as her own name. Then you will help? Sarah looked around the table one more time, seeing the hope and trust in their faces. She thought about the conversation with her mother, about running towards something instead of away from it. She thought about the skills that had taken 15 years to develop and 3 months to abandon. Most importantly, she thought about the people trapped higher up the mountain, counting on someone to make the hard decisions that would bring them safely home. I'll help, she said, and felt something that had been broken inside her chest begin to heal. The decision was made. Tomorrow, Sarah Martinez would return to the cockpit for the first time since the accident that had shattered her confidence. The question was whether 3 months of doubt could be overcome by 15 years of training when lives depended on the answer. Sarah woke at 4:30 a.m. to the sound of wind battering the lodge walls. Through her small window, she could see nothing but grey darkness and the occasional swirl of snow caught in the security lights, weather conditions that would have kept any rational pilot on the ground. But rational wasn't a luxury they could afford today. She dressed quickly in the layers that Ang Dorje had helped her select the night before. Base layers designed for high-altitude operations, insulating jacket, windproof outer shell. The clothing felt foreign compared to her usual flight gear, but the principles were the same. Stay warm, stay dry, maintain dexterity for critical tasks. The lodge was quiet except for the kitchen staff preparing early breakfast for the handful of people involved in the rescue operation. Sarah found Pemba hunched over a radio in the common room, talking quietly in Nepali to spotters positioned at various points up the valley. "Weather report?" Sarah asked, settling beside him with a cup of tea that she hoped would calm her nerves. "Not good," Pemba admitted. "Clouds at 12,000 feet, visibility less than 1 kilometer. But forecast shows possible clearing around 8 a.m., maybe lasting until noon." Sarah nodded, running through the mental checklist that had become automatic during her helicopter career. Weather minimums, fuel calculations, emergency procedures, passenger manifest. The familiar routine was both comforting and terrifying. Dr. Emily Chen joined them a few minutes later, carrying a medical kit that she had assembled from supplies contributed by various trekkers in the lodge. "I've been thinking about triage protocols," she said without preamble. "If we're limited in the number of people we can evacuate, we need clear criteria for who goes first." It was the kind of conversation Sarah had hoped never to have again. During her medical helicopter career, triage decisions had been made by dispatch or medical personnel on scene. The pilot's job was to fly safely and efficiently, not to choose who lived or died. "Most critical first," Sarah said, falling back on established protocols. Immediate life threats, then serious injuries that could become life threats, then everyone else based on available space and weather conditions. "The Japanese climber with the infected leg wound definitely qualifies as immediate," Emily said. "But there are also reports of 2 cases of severe altitude sickness that could progress to cerebral or pulmonary edema." Sarah felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. In a few hours, she would be making split-second decisions that would determine who got a seat on potentially life-saving flights. It was exactly the kind of pressure that had broken her confidence 3 months earlier. Ang Dorje appeared with weather updates from his network of contacts throughout the region. Visibility improving above Tengbosch, still bad at base camp, but wind decreasing. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of preparation and planning. Sarah and Pemba reviewed the AS-350's flight manual, paying particular attention to high-altitude performance charts and emergency procedures. They calculated fuel loads, passenger weights, and power margins for each destination they would need to reach. "Maximum payload to base camp will be pilot plus 2 passengers," Pemba explained, showing Sarah the performance charts. "At Labuche, maybe 3 passengers if we reduce fuel load." Sarah studied the numbers with the precision of someone whose life had depended on similar calculations. Altitude, temperature, weight, and power formed an equation that had no tolerance for wishful thinking or optimistic guesses. "What about landing zones?" she asked. "I assume base camp has a designated helicopter pad?" "Yes, but small and surrounded by obstacles. Requires precision approach in good conditions, very dangerous in marginal weather." As the sky began to lighten, revealing the first hints of the weather conditions they would face, Sarah and Pemba walked to the helicopter for their pre-flight inspection. The morning air was thin and cold, visibility still limited to a few hundred yards by low-hanging clouds. The AS-350 looked different in the grey dawn light, less like the machine that had betrayed her confidence, and more like a tool that could save lives if operated with skill and respect for its limitations. Sarah ran through the external inspection with practiced efficiency, checking control surfaces, hydraulic lines, and the temporary repairs they had made the day before. "Hydraulics holding pressure," Pemba reported from the cockpit. "All systems showing normal." Sarah climbed into the left seat for the first time in 3 months, and the familiarity of the cockpit layout hit her like a physical force. Her hands automatically found the collective cyclic and anti-torque pedals. Her eyes scanned the instrument panel in the systematic pattern that had become second nature over 15 years of flying. For a moment, she was paralyzed by memory. The last time she had sat in a pilot's seat, it had been in the seconds before impact, watching her aircraft fall toward the mountainside while she fought desperately to maintain control. Her hands began to shake, and she felt the familiar tightness in her chest that had kept her grounded for months. "You are ready?" Pemba asked from the right seat, apparently unaware of her internal struggle. Sarah took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus on the present moment rather than the past. There were people trapped on the mountain who needed help, and she was the only person available with the training to provide it. The mathematics were simple, even if the emotions were complicated. "I'm ready," she said, and was surprised to realize she meant it. The engine start sequence was exactly as she remembered. The whine of turbines spinning up, the gradual increase in rotor RPM, the moment when the helicopter transformed from a collection of parts into a living machine ready for flight. Sarah felt muscle memory taking over as she ran through the before takeoff checklist with Pemba. "Namche Tower, this is Rescue Helicopter 9N. ALK requesting departure clearance for search and rescue operations," she said into the radio, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. 9N, ALK cleared for departure. Be advised, visibility remains marginal above 12,000 feet. Recommend extreme caution. Sarah acknowledged the clearance and gently raised the collective, feeling the helicopter's weight shift from the landing skids to the rotor system. For the first time in 3 months, she was flying again. The initial sensation was overwhelming. Every vibration, every sound, every shift in the aircraft's attitude triggered memories of the accident. But as they climbed away from Namche and into the grey morning sky, Sarah found herself focusing on the immediate demands of flight. Reading the instruments, interpreting the weather, maintaining precise control inputs. "Visibility improving ahead," Pemba reported, pointing toward breaks in the cloud layer that revealed glimpses of the mountains beyond.
Their first destination was the Japanese climbing team at Island Peak Base Camp, where the injured climber was reportedly fighting a serious infection.
The flight would take them through some of the most spectacular and dangerous terrain on Earth, following valleys that dropped thousands of feet and passing peaks that reached well above their service ceiling. Sarah flew with the heightened awareness that came from marginal conditions and high stakes. Every control input was deliberate and precise, every navigation decision carefully calculated to maintain safety margins while accomplishing the mission. It was the kind of flying that had made her reputation during her medical helicopter career. "There," Pemba said, pointing to a small cluster of orange tents barely visible against the rocky moraine of Island Peak Base Camp. "Landing zone is flat area beside main tent." Sarah studied the approach, noting the wind direction, obstacles, and escape routes available if something went wrong. The landing zone was smaller than she would have preferred, surrounded by boulders and located at an altitude that reduced both aircraft performance and pilot reaction time. "Winds are variable, maybe 15 knots with gusts," she observed, feeling the helicopter respond to the turbulent air. "Going to be a challenging approach." The final approach required every bit of skill Sarah had developed over 15 years of mountain flying. She compensated constantly for wind shear and downdrafts, maintaining precise control over airspeed and descent rate while threading the helicopter between obstacles that left virtually no margin for error. The landing was textbook perfect, the aircraft settling onto the rocky ground with barely a bump. As the rotor noise decreased to idle, Sarah saw figures emerging from the tents, moving urgently toward the helicopter. The Japanese climber was in worse condition than the radio reports had indicated. His leg wound showed clear signs of serious infection, and he was semi-conscious from fever and altitude sickness.
Doctor!
Emily Chen, who had insisted on accompanying the first rescue flight, quickly assessed his condition while Sarah and Pemba prepared for immediate departure. "He needs surgery within 6 hours," Emily reported. "This infection could go septic very quickly at this altitude." They loaded the patient carefully into the helicopter's cabin, along with one of his teammates who could provide medical history and translation if needed. Sarah ran through her mental calculations. 2 passengers, pilot, co-pilot, fuel load sufficient for direct flight to Kathmandu with emergency reserves. "Next stop, Labuche," Pemba said as they lifted off from Island Peak. 3 trekkers with altitude sickness, 1 showing signs of cerebral edema. The flight to Labuche took them deeper into the heart of the Khumbu region, following the glacier-carved valley that led toward Everest Base Camp. Sarah found herself settling into the rhythm of rescue operations, the familiar pattern of careful flying, punctuated by urgent medical evacuations. At Labuche, they found a group of American trekkers who had been trapped by weather for 4 days. 2 of them showed clear symptoms of severe altitude sickness, including the disorientation and loss of coordination that indicated potential brain swelling. The third was stable but exhausted from caring for his companions. "We can take 2 more passengers," Sarah calculated, factoring in fuel remaining and performance requirements for the higher altitude landing at base camp. Most critical cases first. The loading process was efficient but tense. Every minute spent on the ground was a minute lost from their limited weather window, but rushing medical evacuations was a sure way to make dangerous mistakes. Sarah maintained the disciplined approach that had kept her alive during hundreds of similar operations. As they lifted off from Labuche with 4 passengers aboard, Sarah realized something fundamental had changed. The fear and self-doubt that had paralyzed her for 3 months were still present, but they were no longer in control. She was thinking like a pilot again, making decisions based on training and experience rather than trauma and regret. "Base camp in sight," Pemba reported, pointing to the collection of tents and temporary structures that marked humanity's highest outpost on Everest. But as they approached the famous landmark, Sarah could see that their weather window was already beginning to close. Clouds were building around the higher peaks, and visibility was decreasing rapidly. The easy flights were behind them. The real challenges lay ahead. "How many more people need evacuation from base camp?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer would be more than they could safely carry in the remaining time.
Initial reports said maybe 40 people, Pemba replied.
"Mix of altitude sickness, injuries, and people just trapped by weather. 40 people, 1 helicopter. A weather window that was closing faster than predicted. Sarah did the mathematics automatically. Even under perfect conditions, it would take at least 15 flights to evacuate everyone. With deteriorating weather and mechanical uncertainties, they might have time for 6 or 7 flights at most, which meant that not everyone would be going home that day. As Everest Base Camp grew larger in their windscreen, Sarah prepared herself for the hardest part of any rescue operation, deciding who to save when you couldn't save everyone. Everest Base Camp materialized out of the gathering clouds, like a small city built in defiance of logic and gravity. At 17,598 feet above sea level, it was a temporary settlement of brightly colored tents, supply dumps, and weather monitoring equipment scattered across the Khumbu Glacier's rocky moraine. Sarah had seen photographs of the famous camp countless times, but approaching it as a pilot responsible for evacuating dozens of stranded people gave the landscape an entirely different meaning. "Landing zone is there, beside the medical tent," Pemba said, pointing to a relatively flat area marked with orange cones. "But watch for downdrafts from the icefall. Very unpredictable here." Sarah studied the approach carefully, noting the way the terrain funneled wind in complex patterns that would challenge even experienced mountain pilots. The Khumbu icefall rose like a frozen waterfall to their left, its seracs and crevasses creating turbulence that made the helicopter shudder, even at a distance. As they descended toward the landing zone, figures emerged from tents and shelters throughout the camp. Sarah could see the mix of desperation and hope on upturned faces, the universal expression of people who had been waiting for rescue longer than they had expected to wait. The landing required every bit of precision Sarah possessed. Gusty winds, uncertain ground conditions, and the thin air that reduced both lift and engine performance combined to create an approach that left no room for error. She touched down with barely a bump, the helicopter's skid settling onto a flat area that had been cleared of rocks by the camp's occupants. Before the rotors had even stopped turning, people were moving toward the aircraft with the organized urgency of a well-rehearsed emergency response. A bearded American who introduced himself as Tom Morrison, the expedition leader for one of the largest climbing teams, approached Sarah's window with a clipboard that had clearly seen better days. "Thank God you're here," Tom said, raising his voice over the engine noise. "We've got 18 people who need immediate evacuation, another 22 who should get out today if possible." Sarah felt her stomach drop. Even with multiple flights, the mathematics didn't work. Their weather window was closing faster than predicted, and the helicopter was already showing signs of stress from the high-altitude operations. "I need you to prioritize," Sarah said, climbing out of the cockpit to assess the situation firsthand. "Most critical medical cases first, then anyone who can't survive another night at this altitude." Emily Chen emerged from the passenger cabin where she had been monitoring their evacuated patients and immediately began triaging the cases waiting at base camp. Her medical training took precedence over expedition politics, and Sarah watched with professional admiration as Emily quickly organized the crowd of potential patients by severity of condition. 3 cases of severe altitude sickness, 1 with signs of cerebral edema, Emily reported after a rapid assessment. 2 injuries that need surgical intervention within 12 hours. 1 case of suspected pulmonary edema that's borderline critical. 6 immediate evacuations, plus the 4 passengers they were already carrying. Sarah ran the numbers automatically. Maximum payload to Kathmandu would be 3 additional passengers per flight, which meant 2 flights minimum for the critical cases alone. "What about the others?" Tom asked, his voice carrying the weight of responsibility for team members who were scared but not yet in life-threatening danger. "We'll do as many flights as weather allows," Sarah replied, studying the clouds that were building around the higher peaks. "But I won't compromise safety margins. Better to get some people out safely than lose everyone in a crash." It was exactly the kind of decision that had haunted her since the accident 3 months earlier. The mathematics of risk versus benefit, the calculations that balanced potential lives saved against probable lives lost. Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest, but this time it was accompanied by something else, the confidence that came from 15 years of making similar decisions successfully. The first evacuation flight from base camp carried the 3 most critical altitude sickness cases, all of whom were showing signs of brain or lung swelling that could be fatal without immediate descent to lower altitude. Sarah flew with extra caution, knowing that her passengers' conditions could deteriorate rapidly during the flight. The descent toward Lukla took them through increasingly marginal weather conditions. Visibility dropped to less than half a mile as they navigated between cloud layers, forcing Sarah to rely heavily on instrument flying techniques she hadn't used since the accident. But her hands moved with automatic precision, and she found herself thinking clearly despite the challenging conditions. Hydraulic pressure fluctuating again, Pemba reported during the descent, his voice carefully neutral. Sarah checked the gauge, noting the subtle variations that indicated their temporary repair was beginning to fail under the stress of repeated high-altitude operations. They had maybe 2 more flights before the system would require major repairs or replacement. "How long do those patients need to stabilize before we can continue?" Sarah asked Emily during their brief stop in Lukla. "The cerebral edema case needs at least an hour of oxygen therapy before he can handle another flight," Emily replied. "The others are stable enough for immediate transport to Kathmandu." Sarah looked at the weather moving in from the west and calculated that they might have time for 2 more rescue flights before conditions became impossible. 40 people reduced to 6 flights. The mathematics were brutal, but they were also clear. The second flight back to base camp carried them through weather that was deteriorating faster than any forecast had predicted. Clouds now extended down to 14,000 feet, and Sarah found herself flying entirely on instruments for long stretches of the journey. It was exactly the kind of flying she had hoped never to do again, but her training held firm against the memories of the accident. "Visibility near zero at base camp," Pemba reported as they approached the familiar coordinates. "We'll have to make instrument approach to landing zone." Sarah had performed similar approaches hundreds of times during her medical helicopter career, but never at this altitude, and never with hydraulics that were questionable at best. She flew with the precision of someone who understood that there was no margin for error, no backup plan if something went wrong. The landing was perfect despite the near-zero visibility, guided by GPS coordinates and the voices of people on the ground talking them down through handheld radios. As they touched down, Sarah realized that her confidence was fully restored. The technical skills had never left. Only the trust in herself had been broken. This flight evacuated the 2 injury cases plus 1 additional altitude sickness patient, bringing their total to 9 people safely removed from immediate danger. But as they departed base camp for the second time, Sarah could see that the weather window was closing rapidly, One more flight possible, she told Pemba as they navigated through clouds that now extended from the valley floor to well above the peaks. Maybe two, if hydraulics hold and visibility improves. But when they reached Lukla for the second passenger transfer, both the weather forecast and the helicopter's condition indicated that their rescue operations were reaching their limits. The hydraulic system was showing increasing signs of stress, and cloud cover was becoming solid from ground level to above their service ceiling. How many people still need evacuation? Emily asked during their brief stop. 31, Sarah replied, the number hitting her like a physical blow. Despite their successful flights, there were still 31 people trapped at base camp, waiting for rescue that might not come. Tom Morrison had flown down with the injury cases to coordinate the continuing rescue efforts. Most of them are stable, he reported. Scared and uncomfortable, but not in immediate medical danger. The real problem is supplies. Food and fuel for heating are running low. Sarah found herself facing the kind of decision that had no good answers. She could attempt one more flight in increasingly dangerous conditions, potentially evacuating 3 or 4 more people but risking the lives of everyone aboard if weather or mechanical problems overcame their safety margins. Or she could call off the rescue operations and leave 31 people to wait for conditions to improve, knowing that their situation would become more dangerous with each passing day. What do you think? Pemba asked, and Sarah realized he was deferring to her experience and judgment. Sarah studied the weather charts, the helicopter's maintenance logs, and the faces of people counting on her to make the right decision. It was exactly the kind of moment that had defined her entire aviation career. Technical knowledge balanced against human need, safety protocols weighed against the urgency of people in danger. We make one more flight, Sarah decided. Maximum payload, straight to Kathmandu to avoid another fuel stop. But we set strict weather minimums and turn back immediately if conditions deteriorate below safe limits. The final flight to base camp was the most challenging of Sarah's career. Visibility was near zero, hydraulics were fluctuating wildly, and the cloud ceiling had dropped to barely above the camp elevation. She flew entirely on instruments, guided by GPS and the steady voice of Pemba, reading altitude and heading corrections. Base camp in sight, Pemba announced as they broke through the clouds just 500 feet above the landing zone. The scene that greeted them was both heartbreaking and inspiring. 31 people stood in organized groups beside their packed equipment, ready for evacuation, but understanding that not all of them would be leaving that day. Tom Morrison had clearly established priorities based on medical need, expedition logistics, and simple human compassion. 4 passengers maximum, Sarah announced as she shut down the engine. Most vulnerable first. The loading process was efficient and emotional. Sarah watched families saying goodbye, team members making impossible decisions about who should go and who should stay. It was the human cost of the mathematics that governed all rescue operations. Among the 4 passengers they loaded was Maria Santos, a Spanish mountaineer who had been showing early signs of altitude sickness, and James Chen, a Taiwanese climber whose altitude tolerance had proven insufficient for base camp's elevation. The other 2 passengers were support staff who had volunteered to stay until the end, but were finally being sent to safety. As they lifted off from Everest Base Camp for what Sarah hoped would not be the final time, she carried with her the faces of the 27 people still waiting on the ground. The weight of that responsibility was familiar from her medical helicopter career, but it felt different now, less like a burden and more like a trust. The flight to Kathmandu was a testament to everything Sarah had learned about flying in challenging conditions. Hydraulics failed completely 50 miles from the capital, forcing her to fly with manual controls that required constant attention and physical strength. Visibility remained marginal throughout the descent, and fuel reserves dropped to levels that left no room for delays or diversions. But they made it. As the helicopter touched down at Tribhuvan International Airport, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since the accident 3 months earlier, the quiet satisfaction of a mission completed successfully. She had evacuated 13 people from life-threatening situations, demonstrated that her flying skills remained intact, and proven to herself that one bad day didn't define an entire career. Over the following week, as improved weather allowed other helicopters to complete the evacuation of the remaining climbers from base camp, Sarah learned that her actions had saved more lives than she had initially realized. The Japanese climber with the infected leg underwent successful surgery that prevented the spread of sepsis. The 3 altitude sickness cases made complete recoveries after receiving proper medical care. The 2 injury cases healed fully and returned to climbing within months. But the most important rescue had been her own. Sitting in the cockpit of Pemba's helicopter, making life-and-death decisions under pressure, Sarah had rediscovered the pilot she had always been underneath the fear and self-doubt. The accident would always be part of her story, but it no longer defined the end of her story. Dr. Amanda Rivera called it post-traumatic growth when Sarah returned to Denver and resumed her medical helicopter career. The technical term for the way some people emerge from tragedy stronger and more capable than they had been before. Sarah preferred to think of it as remembering who she was when stripped of everything except the skills and courage that really mattered. 6 months later, Sarah received a letter from Nepal. It was signed by all 31 people who had been at base camp during the rescue operation, thanking her for the reminder that sometimes heroes look like tourists until the moment when heroism is required. She kept the letter in her flight bag, alongside her pilot's license and her mother's note about running towards something instead of away from it, because she had learned that the difference between being grounded and being ready to fly was often just a matter of trust. Trust in training that proved reliable under pressure. Trust in equipment that responded predictably to skilled operation. But most importantly, trust in the knowledge that being afraid didn't make you weak, it made you human. And being human, Sarah discovered, was exactly what the world needed in the thin air above the highest places on Earth, where mathematics and courage combined to make the impossible merely difficult.